we've seen how the history of the West has been punctuated by several great civilizations that have risen and fallen as political and economic entities. And we've also seen how underneath that rise and fall of great civilizations are ethical and also property institutions and different systems. The property institution is not unrelated to ethics, as we've been saying several times earlier. What I want to do now is go through the way that that connection exists. In this presentation, I'm going to be looking at what I'm going to call the classical property theories. And in that, we're going to be roughly looking at the first half of the story. And that is those approaches to property that were grounded in fairly subtle intellectual arguments that run from the classical Greek era up until the beginning of modernity. In a separate presentation, we'll be looking at modern property theory, which is probably what we're most immersed in today. But because we are immersed in it, it's a bit more difficult to see objectively. So we'll start with classical property theory. The first question that we have to do battle with is the question of the problem of property. We have seen, or we can appreciate, that land property, the institution of property, property rights, whatever we want to call them, is only ever a social convention. And because it's a convention, those conventions change. Some conventions are better than others. And so we need a way of working out whether the convention that we are using at present is better or worse than some other possible convention, especially in situations where the society is going through some period of change where it is considering some change to the convention of property. What we need to do to be able to do that is a lot more than simply some opinion. We need to have identified clear criteria that can be used to identify what makes a property institution better or worse, or what ethical, social, economic criteria should be used when we're considering change to our convention of property. And so we're going to be giving some thought to the criteria that are to be used. And that gives us the basis to inform the convention, the basis to inform debate and intellectual development that should go before the convention is changed. It is said that all great societies are based on great ideas. Unfortunately, bad societies are based on bad ideas. And if you want a society to go bad, you simply let the bad ideas overtake the good ones. And so it's important for us to get some kind of an idea of what distinguishes the good ideas for property rights from the bad ones. Let's look a bit further at what conventions are, conventions and institutions. Conventions are positive human social constructs. We can call them artifacts, those things which are human products, products of human society. We've already suggested that they differ in effectiveness, and I would say there's evidence of it even in the last half century, where the convention of property, which is being used or has been used in Australia, has changed because the thinking of society has changed to the point where it considers that there is a better convention that can be adopted. And this is certainly evident in the area of town planning and ecological controls and so on. And so we've seen that the ideas about what makes an ideal society have determined the direction of property, say the introduction of environmental planning laws and things like that, and even things like just terms of compensation. It's a novelty in the convention of property. It's not necessary, but it's considered to give us a better, a more effective institution of property than if we had other approaches. I've claimed earlier that conventions are fundamentally ethical, and that means that they are evaluated using ethical criteria. What we have to do, therefore, to understand the institution of property, is to understand a little bit more about the intellectual foundations of that whole area of ethical thought, what is really a part of moral philosophy. I'll be arguing that there are a number of approaches to ethics, and that some, well, at least ideally, ethical criteria may be analysed objectively. Now, in our culture, we're moving to a point where we're moving away from that position, but unfortunately it's associated with a lot of unfortunate outcomes. However, if ethical criteria can be analysed objectively, so can property. Now, to make the claim that we can know anything with objective certainty, we have to understand something about human knowing. The first thing we need to look at is the whole idea of human understanding, and the relationship between understanding, as in the ideas that we have of the world outside of us, and the relationship between those ideas and the world outside of us. Okay, that really gives us the very starting point for any intellectual endeavour. That conformity of the relationship between the ideas I might have and I might speak to you about and the reality outside is the test which I'm going to define as what truth is. If I come in here and rabbit on to you about all sorts of weird and fanciful things, but they don't conform to reality, you will not have learnt anything. In fact, one of the questions that you will have to answer for yourselves as you get to know this lecturer or that lecturer or what have you, or even this book or that book, is if the things that that book or that lecturer are telling you do in fact conform to reality, to external reality. Which means that what I'm telling you and what a book is going to tell you, or what the Sydney Morning Herald is going to tell you, has to be more than opinion. The difficulty today is that we live in a world where very few people understand the difference between knowledge and opinion. They both have to do with beliefs. I might believe that the earth is hollow and occupied by lizard men who run the world. Now, if I teach you that, I might be teaching you my opinion. But am I actually informing your knowledge? I would say not. I may, if I'm a very influential speaker, be able to get you to share my opinion. I hope not. And the reason is because that opinion does not conform with reality. But it might conform with my belief, and unfortunately I might be able to get you to have the same belief. And so what we need to do is work out some way of separating beliefs which are worth holding on to, which we will say are conformed to reality, and beliefs which I might hold on to, which for whatever reason are very risky and likely to be untrue. The opinion that the earth is hollow and filled with lizard men may be an opinion, and might be a belief that I hold, but is not definitively proven. It's not known with sufficient certainty to be able to say it's highly unlikely that it is not true. However, I may feel it, I may believe it, I may have been taught it by somebody I trust for some reason, probably not a good reason, but I still might have held that. That can be contrasted to beliefs that I hold that I will call knowledge. Knowledge is defined, or was defined by Plato, as justified true belief. Each one of those three words in the definition are very important. Knowledge as justified true belief. We're talking about beliefs, and we understand what beliefs are. Knowledge is one class of belief, which has the distinction of something that I hold in my mind, a series of statements that I hold in my mind, that are considered especially likely to be true. How can I make sure they're true? How can I make sure that these ideas in my mind conform with the reality outside? I do that by some form of justification, some form of testing, some form of intellectual endeavour, which enables me to be confident that the idea in my mind does in fact conform to reality. Often we'll do that by testing, by going out and touching or feeling or smelling or seeing or listening to justify my belief. Humans are capable of knowing things, though, that can't be seen, felt, touched, smelt, and so on, or even measured by some scientific piece of equipment. For instance, I know two. We've talked about two before. It's this peculiar thing that we all know, and we understand how it behaves and what it is, but we've never seen it. We may have seen two people walking hand in hand down the street. We may have seen two sparrows flying together. We might have seen two pencils on a table, but we haven't actually seen two. Two is the mathematical abstraction which comes from seeing a pair of things in some way. But I would say I know it. I also know that 2 multiplied by 3 equals 6. What does multiplied mean? Have I seen it? Have I touched it? No. And the same with 3 and the equals and 6. But I know it with certainty, and there are ways of justifying it intellectually. There is a methodology to testing the truth, to justifying the truth in mathematics. It's a different approach to testing the truth of propositions, of statements in physics or chemistry, but nevertheless it is quite rigorous, and it justifies my knowledge as true and therefore worthy of belief. So this is the distinction that we need to make. What can I know about property as opposed to what I can believe as a result of some vague opinion or some inclination of the heart or whatever? Because these are the things which are intellectually robust, and they are capable of moving our society, our civilization, in a direction which is going to be stronger and more reliable. It's not going to have unexpected things happen. If I organise my political beliefs around lizard men from Antarctica or something, that might help me to understand why some political leader I don't like seems a bit bizarre. But it will let me down very often, and probably on those occasions when I most need a better understanding of political realities. And so opinions may help me in some places, but they are certainly not reliable, and especially they're likely to be unreliable on those occasions when I most need them. Let's look at the way that I can know some things. We've talked about 2. We've talked about the lizard men, in the hollow earth and so on. 1 I can say I know even though I can't sense it. Another one I can say I can talk about it, but I find it so bizarre that I don't believe that it could ever be proven true, even though I haven't been to Antarctica and I haven't drilled down into the centre of the earth to see if it's hollow or not. Let's look at some examples of statements I can make, statements that I can hold in my head and I can speak to other people meaningfully about. For instance, the statement, I exist, or the whole is greater than the part. Both of those statements, first of all, let's look at I exist. I exist is something that when I make that statement, and you can make this statement, it is a statement which cannot fail to be true, because the act of thinking about it justifies, proves, validates my existence. And so the fact of my existence is proven by the fact that I can make the statement, I exist. There are things that exist that can't make that statement. Rocks can't make that statement. Trees can't make that statement. I could possibly even say that making the statement, I exist, may be a proof that I am human. But that's another topic which we'll get onto another time. Suffice to say, by being able to make the statement, I exist, is something which is necessarily and objectively true. It is not an opinion. Likewise, the whole is greater than the part. There is no situation where the part is greater than the whole. We can talk about, in some cases, symbiosis and so on, where maybe the sum of the parts is greater, makes a whole which is greater than the sum of the parts. But that's, if you like, a different issue. This simple idea, or this statement, or this conclusion, if I have a piece of a pie, the one thing I know is that it's less than the pie. So it's necessarily and objectively true. It is not an opinion. I might believe it. I might tell it to you. You might believe it. You can say that it's your opinion, but in fact it's more than your opinion because it's possible of being justified. There are other statements which are also objectively true, even though they may not have the absolute and universal validity of these first two statements. At 10:15, there was a class held in UTS 6.0440 in Property and Political Economy. That statement is either true or false. If I pick the wrong date, I may have a period when there is no class. If I pick the right date and there was a class there, that statement is objectively true. It is not an opinion. It is an objectively true statement, a conformity of the statement with reality. And many of the things that we use in the natural sciences come from statements like that, statements which happen to be true because of the circumstances of the world. These statements relate to realities that were either were or were not the case. They are either true or not true. Now, we use these expressions commonly. In fact, we wouldn't be able to have intellectual dialogue, and we wouldn't be able to talk to each other if we weren't confident of this conformity of the statements that we think and exchange with each other. If they didn't conform with reality, we simply wouldn't have the confidence to actually deal with other people. They are not a function of perception necessarily, or opinion. Now, with that background, what we can move into is the question of what can be known with certainty, with the kind of certainty of the statement, I exist, giving us certainty of our existence. What can be known with certainty about property? To answer that question, we have to start with looking at what the meaning of property is. The word property. We get that word from the discipline of philosophy, and in particular that part of philosophy known as metaphysics. A property is a necessary attribute of a thing. For something to be proper to a thing, to be correct if you like, to be proper. A property of each one of us human beings is that if we're normally formed, if we're this kind of person that we would find pictured in an anatomy book, we would have fingers and toes, normally 10 of them. And so we can say a property of human beings is to have fingers. Another property is to have toes. Another property is to be alive. Another property is to require oxygen for life. And so there's a whole series of properties. And if we come along and find something which doesn't have fingers and toes, maybe doesn't breathe oxygen, and it looks like it's not dead or something, or a result of a car accident, we would say that thing is unlikely to be a human, because there are things that are proper to humans that that thing doesn't have. It is proper for humans to have heads and torsos. Likewise, if we find something that doesn't have one of those things, highly unlikely it's a human, certainly not a live human. We can look at inanimate things and look at the properties of other things, and we use this in science all the time as a way of understanding stuff. A property of water at common standard temperature and pressure is that it boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level pressure and regular temperature, if you like. What that means is that if I come across a substance which is not a liquid that boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level pressure, unlikely that I have water I might have a piece of rock, I might have some oil, or I might have some other substance. But the one thing I know is that I do not have water, because it is proper, it is correct, it is appropriate, it is necessary for water to boil at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level pressure. And so in the textbooks in science, one of the things I'll learn, how to identify water, look for a clear liquid that boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level pressure. A property of humans is that they need land resources to live. This is proper to humans. We cannot live without the air, as we've talked about, and water. And as we've seen, the factor of production that we are calling land includes air and water. We also need food, which also comes from raw materials that we get from the land. We need a place to be able to sit down, to sleep at night, to be sheltered from the elements. We need a place to earn our living. We need the resources of the land in order to support our lives. That is a property of humanity. Humans can't live without that. Sure enough, we can put ourselves in spacecraft and go up and visit the moon and so on. And so we're not actually using the land as in the land underneath us right now. But we have to do an awful lot of work to create an environment which is very similar to the land in order for us to be able to live under those situations. And as we defined land as all of those things which exist without human agency, even things like the moon, if we go there, doesn't violate this property of humanity. And so we can say this is a universal true statement about one of the fundamental properties of humanity. Now, this particular property is not the property we normally talk about when we talk about the property of a person. Particular property assets, oddly enough, are not proper or necessary for humans. Humans do not need to have a particular backyard or a particular area of land to go and plant their crops, or a particular place to run their workshop or what have you. Particular property assets are not proper. We can take them away and not cause the human person to be not a human person. Interestingly enough, even talking at this fundamental level, we find a cultural conflict, if you like, because on this particular point, indigenous people all over the world tend to consider that they lose something of their humanity when they are separated from their land. We don't understand that because our culture doesn't share that view. However, for indigenous people, generally, they would say that the land, their tribal land, is proper to them. And so in a sense, their understanding of property is far more fundamental, perhaps philosophical, than ours is. However, even an indigenous person, if they are separated from their land, will not immediately die. They might get a little depressed or what have you, but they won't necessarily die in the same way that any other human being would if you were to deprive them of air or water. Okay, when we talk about land property, we're actually talking about a convention that connects persons, individual human beings, to particular parts of the Earth's surface, to particular land assets. In some cases, those land assets might be only vaguely determined by space, by pegs in the ground or what have you. It might simply be that mountain or this river or something. And it may be determined in more precise ways than simply, that area of land. It might be the mineral rights, for instance, or it might be the water rights in a particular tract of land. And so we might determine it that somebody has the rights to all the gold they can find within a particular spatial area, parcel of land. It's a convention, and the convention is not natural, it is only conventional. It is something which has been determined by our society for the convenience of our society. And it is a function of our society. Let's look at the objective attributes of real property, of land. We've already gone over most of these. Land is necessary for life. We can say that objectively, certainly, universally. Also, it is not naturally owned by anyone. We're not born with a certificate of title kind of in our hand. And we're certainly not going to die if we lose it. Land is capable of being used to exploit tenants, or exploit anybody for that matter. It's an unfortunate fact of history. It's not necessary, but it's possible. Land can also be used as an economic method of transferring incomes or wealth from labour to the landowner. And again, we've been studying this in a number of circumstances so far. And as a result of that, it can be used to concentrate economic power, effective economic power. The first couple of statements here, I would say, are metaphysical truths. They are truths, statements about the nature of the being of property, of how property exists, the nature of its existence. Though it is always necessarily true. That's a metaphysical statement. Metaphysics is the study of being, of the nature of how things exist. And so we can say that property exists, land property exists, as a necessity for life. That's part of its being. And it's how the being of the land relates to the being or the existence of humanity. This last major point, the way that property is capable of being used, has been used, perhaps is being used in some cases today, really relates to ethical aspects, aspects of appropriate relations between humans. What we need to do now is ask the question, if these are all the things that we know with absolute certainty, the metaphysical truths about land and the ethical aspects of what land is capable of doing, we can ask the question, on what basis? What are the arguments? What are the principles that should underlie our allocation of particular parts of the earth space to individual people? And that leads on to the economic question of distributive justice, which we've looked at before, which has to do with the return between property and wages. Before we get to that, we need to tease out a little bit further our understanding of ethics, in particular ethics for property institutions. We can say, I think, and we can justify, although I don't have time to do it here, that humans have equal dignity. Some cultures have not had that belief. They are cultures, typically, that practice slavery on large scale, and perhaps human sacrifice, and other places where there is the practice involved, maybe even an institution, which is grounded, which has its foundation on a principle that humans are different. Some humans can be eaten if I'm a cannibal. Some humans can be enslaved if I'm an ancient Roman or an ancient Greek, or maybe an early 19th century American, or for that matter an early 19th century English merchant who was in the business of collecting humans in Africa and then selling them as slaves into the United States. We don't live in a culture like that. I'd say we have a more correct understanding of humanity based on the recognition that all humans are biologically coming from the same origin. We all have 46 chromosomes. We're all part of the same species. We are therefore all have a form of equality, and we can justify that on the basis of our shared intellect and will, the ability that we can understand things, unlike at a level that is not shared by other creatures, and we all have free will, which enables us to determine our actions by something above instinct or necessity. And because of our intellect and especially our will, we have the capacity for moral action, and therefore we, all sharing that equally, have equal dignity. I would say that humans, as a result of their equal dignity, have the right to a number of things. Life primarily, fulfillment as also coming from our life, and humans have inalienable rights to the fruit of their labour. We've talked earlier about the way that the fruit of your labour is, in a sense, the embodiment, the personification, not the personification, the embodiment, the crystallization of a part of your life. If I spend a day writing a poem, I could have spent my day doing something else. And so as a result of that, there's a day of my life spent in writing that poem. Or it might be a song. I might be able to sell that song to some musician or a music company or something. And that is justly and rightly mine because it comes from my life, which I own, from the second bullet point. And so the fruit of my labour is mine, naturally. I don't have to justify that. I can justify it intellectually, but I don't have to go to down the street and do some elaborate proof to say that this song that I wrote, on a Saturday is actually mine. The fact that I wrote it says that. Because of our right to life, we also have an unusual or a more subtle, perhaps secondary right to access to land resources. If I was to buy up all of the water rights in the world, I would have the capacity, perhaps, of withholding those water rights or selling them because I might own them. They're my property rights. Okay. What happens if you come along and you say, I'd like to buy some water off you, please, and I say to you, that's fine. I don't think you can afford it. Please go away. I've got somebody else standing behind you in the queue who's got more money. What does that mean for your life? Well, it means that shortly you're going to die of thirst. That suggests that there are ways of owning property rights, land property rights, in this case property in water. We could be talking about property in air, could be talking about access to food or a livelihood. But there are ways of violating fundamental human right to life by the misuse of property resources. You can say, well, that's a very extreme example. But you see, even before we get to the extreme, we have situations, and I would say the situation existed in England in the 18th century, where the property right regime was causing people to move into such desperation in what was fundamentally a very wealthy country, to the point where that desperation meant that they either had to violate property rights or die. There have been a number of philosophers over the years who have said that if property rights are capable of violating fundamental human rights, especially when those property rights exist so as to give the holder of the property rights inordinate, unnecessary and excessive access to property that they don't actually need for their personal needs, their personal enjoyment, whatever, then those property rights tend to dissolve. And that would say that if I own all of the food in Australia, maybe all the water in Australia, and while I might be able to sell it to you for a reasonable price, if I sell it to you for such a high price that many of you will die of starvation or thirst, then my property rights actually dissolve as a result of your desperation and the likelihood of you having your life curtailed as a result of my property rights. That's really a topic in itself, but it gives you an idea of the possible limits that exist within the convention of property that come from the nature of the things involved, the nature of land, the nature of humanity. We've already gone over most of these points, but it's good to have them summarized. Let's look though at the lower two. We've already gone over the first couple, but then we looked at some practical aspects of what it is to be human. A practical aspect of humans is that we tend to be lazy and we tend to be greedy. We tend to look after things better when we are responsible for them ourselves. If I own something personally, I'm more likely to care for it better. And if I can obtain the fruits of my labour using it, I'm more likely to be more efficient using it. We tend to look after things better when we are responsible for them, and we tend to abuse what is freely available. It's one of the great problems with socialism, is that the socialised ownership of the means of production means that people tend to abuse them, and they don't tend to even bother using them. because their livelihood comes from something apart from actually their work. And so these two lower points relate to problems that come when we don't have a connection to external property. We can lump these two, we can classify these two sets of aspects of our relationship with property into the first two, suggesting the necessity for some form of common ownership. Because we don't have a natural connection to any particular land asset, but we do have the need for it for our survival, for our human flourishing. However, the second 2 points suggest the merits, the necessity in fact, of private ownership. Now if we look at that, it appears that they're almost moving in opposite directions. On one hand, we're saying we don't have a necessary connection to individual assets, and we do have some need of access to them. On the other hand, we're saying we need private connections or personal connections to them, right? And our privatized access is actually a benefit. So we're saying almost the opposite things. What it means is that our principle of property, our theory of property, has to somehow resolve this tension between the natural common use and the practical human ethical necessity, if you like, comes from the nature of human frailty. This tension that makes private ownership necessary. And this is the issue, the question, the tension that exists all through the history of humanity with respect to property. How to resolve a practical institution of property that resolves the necessity, the practical necessity for private ownership, with the similar practical necessity, the metaphysical necessity for common use. And this really gives us the intellectual framework with which to review all institutions of property. Let's look at how that those ideas existed in early Greek thought. The early Greeks, as we saw property rightfully for the use of the family. And so the family owned property individually, as individual families, if you like, but also corporately, because the family was a collection of humans. Everyone belongs to a family, and so everyone can benefit from the family's property. So if some long-lost cousin or aunt or nephew wandered up to some Greek clan and said, "Oh, guess what? You know, I'm your uncle's cousin's brother-in-law or something," they'd say, "Oh, you're part of the family. Come in and we'll feed you." Okay. And so the property rights were used for the good of those. In some way they were common. But they were also fiercely guarded by the family. If someone came in and tried to take the family's property, they would fight with them tooth and nail. When Aristotle in particular looked at some of the Greek city-states, especially Sparta, what he saw was something which we would probably see as something similar to a socialist kind of environment. They used to use their property rights largely in a collective way. They would even use a collective approach for meals and so on. And so there were aspects of some Greek city-states, especially Sparta, that used property in a very visibly common way. There were other places, say Athens, where it was more identifiable as private, especially later on in that unfortunate period where private property, absolute private property, tended to overtake the family approach. So what we see in early Greek practice, if you like, before we get to theory, is a number of different approaches. We had Sparta, we had Athens, we had the patriarchal family property and so on. When Aristotle looked at this, especially at a point in time when Greece was not looking so healthy, he sat back, looked at a lot of the examples, thought about them, and then from his observations, he ended up with what we know as his dual theory of property. And largely the previous few slides have been explaining the logic of Aristotle's theory of property. His theory of property, his dual theory of property, was private ownership with common use. And that, if you like, informed a more enlightened, a more thoughtful, a more ethical approach to property. It didn't necessarily mean that Aristotle was able to bring that in. He wasn't a politician. He was the tutor of Alexander the Great, but he himself was not a political leader. But other people who have taken these ideas have been able to use them for the benefit of society. Unfortunately, some people prefer to ignore them because it gives greater benefits to individuals. We'll move along now. We won't go through the property theories in Rome and so on. They had an equally interesting variety. But we'll move to the high medieval ages, the high Middle Ages, and the theoretical contribution of St. Thomas Aquinas, who really represents the pinnacle of this medieval thought, the medieval philosophy that preceded the modern. And so as pre-modern thinking, Thomas Aquinas is very important. Aquinas recognized that property is a convention. And he also noticed that property assets are most effectively managed when they're privately owned. He argued this on the basis of observations about human frailty in his world, based as it was on a Christian worldview, where humans were capable of acting with merit, with virtue, as good people, but they were also had to be discouraged from acting unethically or sinfully. Recognized that private property had the advantage of providing the opportunity for frail, greedy, selfish humans to be able to take responsibility for their property aspects, for their property assets, and so encouraged to be virtuous. And so Aquinas would say that for the encouragement of virtue, land should be privately owned. These days we don't often use the encouragement of virtue as a justification of private property. Sometimes we do, especially for things like private ownership of motor cars or something. But it tends not to be a major aspect of the argument in favour of land property. Aquinas also noted that land was not natural. In fact, it is naturally common, and therefore its use must also be in common because of the nature of the thing. Aquinas really was giving us a more elaborate presentation of the Aristotelian dual theory, private ownership, which you can see the necessity for on the basis of the sinful nature of humanity, linked with common use because of the metaphysical underpinnings, the metaphysical nature of land. And so he would say that privatization of common property is licit so long as the disenfranchised are not disadvantaged. So if I sail up to some island which appears to have no inhabitants, it's quite reasonable for me to take it as my island. However, if I discover later that there are a tribe of people living up in the hills that maybe I hadn't seen in my first encounter with them, I can't go up to them and say, "Oh, you're on my island, you'll have to get off. And if you don't get off, I'm going to shoot you dead." Okay? That would disadvantage those people who would be disenfranchised, lose their rights as a result of my private property. That's fairly simple and obvious to a certain extent. It becomes a little bit more subtle when we get into Western examples, but the rules are still operating. A contemporary of Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, took a different philosophical approach, probably more of a mystical theological approach, but it's also quite visibly based on ethics when he considered the question of property. Bonaventure noted that it is hard to treat your brother justly if you do not first love him. They're very nice words, and you think, how does that work in the commercial and political environment of today? Well, in fact, it does, but we just don't notice it a great deal. It operates whenever we have anything which attempts to be an exercise of justice. And the reason for that is that justice is always a gift which the strong, politically or economically, give to the weak. Just think about it. If I have the power, because I happen to be holding a gun, to take your wallet, and I choose not to, maybe because I'm a policeman, I'm treating you justly. I'm allowing you to retain what is yours. In fact, I might even use my gun to stop other people with broken bottles or fists or clubs of wood or something from taking your wallet as well. I don't have to. I could join with them. And in some cases, policemen have been known to do that. But they're not acting justly. They have the power to treat someone unjustly, but they choose to do it out of some sense of fraternity, of brotherhood. Our indigenous friends tend to be very aware of the importance of brotherly relations, what Bonaventure would refer to as brotherly love, as a fundamental for any civilization, any people, any nation. And realistically, if you think about it, our Australian culture would not work if we didn't have at least some base level of concern, care, therefore love, of our fellows when we go to treat the question of justice. How does this apply to the question of property? Bonaventure made the same observation that just about all indigenous people do, that the world is a gift from God, who loves humanity. Property is a loan from God that should be used to love others materially. From that, and the permission for private property, there is the conclusion that our reason for existence is to grow in conformity with love, and therefore a loving person will use his material resources, his property, for the good of his neighbour, to treat him justly. Now this is a very different approach, a different theory if you like, but it has the advantage that it comes to the same conclusion as Aquinas, the same conclusion as Aristotle, and the same conclusion ultimately that we saw came from the metaphysical facts of property, and for that matter also the practical ethical observations about how it can be used. That takes us, if you like, right through the ancient world. I say we haven't gone through the sophist argument for private property. However, we will be meeting that when we go through modern property theory, which we'll be doing in a separate presentation.